They are the ultimate personification of terror in the Third Age. But they were not born of shadow. They were born of men. Their fall was not a singular evil choice, but a slow, creeping poison that took centuries to consume them. A grand tragedy of ambition that makes the fall of Boromir seem like a fleeting moment of weakness. Before they were the 9 riders, they were 9 kings. And this is the story of how the greatest of mortal men became the most terrible of immortal monsters. The tale begins not in an age of darkness, but in one of blinding light. The Second Age of the Sun was a time of high hope and peerless craft. The exiled men of Númenor held dominion over the seas, their wisdom and lifespan far exceeding those of lesser men. In Middle-earth, the elven smiths of Eregion, led by the grandson of Fëanor himself, Celebrimbor, sought to create works of beauty and power that would rival the creations of the Valar, to preserve the memory of their blessed homeland. Into this world of ambition and artistry came a stranger. He was fair of form and wise of counsel, calling himself Annatar, the Lord of Gifts. His knowledge seemed boundless, his desire to aid the peoples of Middle-earth genuine. He taught the elven smiths secrets of craft they had never dreamed of, guiding their hands and their minds towards a new, magnificent obsession, the forging of rings of power. He was, of course, Sauron, the greatest of the Maiar, once a servant of the Vala of Craft, Alkile. But now, his only craft was deceit. Under his tutelage, the Gwaith y Myrdain, the people of the jewelsmiths, began their great work. 16 rings they forged with his guidance, but Celebrimbor, wisest of them all, forged another 3 in secret, untouched by Sauron's influence. And far away, in the fires of Mount Doom, the Dark Lord forged his own secret, 1 ring to rule them all. When Sauron placed the 1 ring upon his finger, the elves were at once aware of him. They knew they had been betrayed, and they hid the 3. But the other 16, Sauron gathered to himself after a devastating war that left Eregion in ruins, and Celebrimbor slain upon a pole. The Dark Lord now possessed the tools of his ultimate dominion, but the elves were beyond his grasp. So he turned his gaze to the other free peoples of Middle-earth. Who, then, could be tempted by a promise of power? Who yearned for lordship and riches above all else? Sauron knew the hearts of all races, and the hearts of men he knew were the most easily dominated. The Silmarillion tells us that those who received the 9 rings were mighty in their day, kings, sorcerers, and warriors of old. They were not evil men, not in the beginning. They were the leaders of their people, men of immense pride, wealth, and ambition. 3 of them were great lords of the Númenorians, already gifted with long life and great wisdom, but ever hungry for more. The others were chieftains and sorcerers from the east and south, men who already dabbled in dark arts and held sway over vast, forgotten kingdoms. But who were these men, truly? Before the black robes and the terrifying shrieks, what names did their people once cheer? The chronicles are tragically silent on most of their names, for their identities were devoured by the very rings they so eagerly accepted. We know of one, Khamûl, a king of the Easterlings, who after Sauron became the Shadow of the East and the lord of the fortress of Dol Guldur. Another, and the greatest of them, is believed to have been a king of Númenorian blood, a man of immense power and knowledge who ruled a colonial kingdom in Middle-earth, a man who would one day become the most feared of all. He would become the Witch King of Angmar. To each of these 9 men, the rings were a gift beyond mortal comprehension. In the beginning, they delivered on every promise. The kings and warriors achieved victories and renown that echoed through the ages. The sorcerers gained knowledge that unlocked the hidden secrets of the world. They built great kingdoms, amassed vast treasuries, and their lifespans were stretched unnaturally, far beyond the measure of other men. They could, if they wished, walk unseen, a great advantage for a king or a conqueror. They thought themselves masters of their own fate, their power absolute. They were fools. Every treasure they gained, every battle they won, every year of life they stole from the world, only tightened the chain that bound them to the master of the One Ring. The rings were extensions of Sauron's own will. He was the master, and they, his unwitting apprentices in their own damnation. The power they wielded was not their own. It was merely borrowed from the darkness. The rings gave them life beyond measure. But what is life, when the one who grants it owns your very soul? The process was not swift. It was a slow, agonizing decay of the spirit that spanned centuries. The extended life became a curse, an endless, weary road with no hope of release. The world of the living, the warmth of the sun, the taste of food, the touch of another person, all began to fade. Their physical bodies became thin and stretched, their senses dulled to the vibrant reality around them. They were becoming ghosts while still drawing breath. But as the physical world faded, Another world became terrifyingly clear. The unseen world, the spirit realm. The rings had drawn their wearers half into this spectral plane, and now they could perceive it constantly. It was a world of shadows and whispers, dominated by the one terrible, ever-present will that emanated from the land of Mordor, Sauron's will. Their will was not their own. Their bodies faded. Their spirits were enslaved. They could walk unseen amongst the living, a terrifying advantage. But what happens when you can only exist in the shadows, and the world of light becomes a painful memory? The Nine became permanently invisible, wraiths in the truest sense. To be seen by mortal eyes, they had to clothe themselves in the raiments of the dead black robes and hoods to give terrifying shape to the nothingness that they had become. Their own faces, their own forms, were gone forever, consumed by the power they had craved. The end of their mortal journey came in the year 2251 of the Second Age, nearly 700 years after they first accepted the rings. One by one, their physical lives finally failed, but there was no peace. There was no journey to the halls of their fathers. Death was a release they had forfeited. Their spirits, shackled by the power of the Nine Rings, were utterly and eternally bound to the will of the One. They were drawn, like moths to a black flame, across the continent of Middle-earth to the land of shadow. They were gathered to their master. The Nine Kings were dead, but their servitude had only just begun. Gathered before their new master, they were given new purpose and a new, undying hatred for the world of the living. They were no longer men. They were the Uluri, the Nazgûl, the Ringwraiths, Sauron's most terrible servants, and their first great and terrible task was about to be unleashed upon the world. But what could that first task be? What command would be so absolute, so terrible, that it would cement their damnation for all eternity? Was it simply to wage war? To conquer lands in their master's name? No. Sauron's cruelty was far more refined, far more personal than that. Their first task was a test, a final, brutal act of severance from the men they had once been. Sauron commanded them to return to the very kingdoms they had once ruled, to the peoples they had once led, and to tear it all down. They were to become the instruments of ruin for their own legacy. The Easterling kings were sent back to the east, not as triumphant rulers, but as specters of terror, their very presence a poison that turned fields to dust and brother against brother. The sorcerers were sent to unravel the very orders they had once sought to master, spreading plague and madness. And the Witch King, the fallen son of Númenor, was unleashed upon the remaining Númenorian colonies in Middle-earth. It was the ultimate act of psychological warfare, a message to all who might defy the Dark Lord. No one is beyond his reach, and everything you love can and will be turned against you. Imagine the horror. A captain of the guard, standing resolute against a tide of orcs, suddenly faltering as he sees the Wraith King who haunts his people's darkest legends. It is a king who, his own grandfather once told him, had been a great ruler from their own line, a man of their own blood, now returned as a monster from a half-forgotten age. This was the Nazgûl's true power in these early wars. Not just sorcery or martial skill, but the sheer, soul-crushing terror they inspired. They were living ghosts, a walking embodiment of hope turned to despair. For over 1,000 years, they were Sauron's chief agents in the long war against the last alliance of elves and men. And in the north, the Witch King found his own special purpose. In the year 1300 of the Third Age, long after Sauron's first defeat, a shadow fell upon the mountains north of Rivendell. A kingdom of pure evil was founded there, Angmar, and its master was the Lord of the Nazgûl, now known forevermore as the Witch King of Angmar. This was not just a military outpost, it was a personal vendetta. The Witch King built his kingdom as a poisoned dagger aimed at the heart of the Dunedain, the descendants of his own Númenorian people who had remained faithful to the Valar. He gathered to him all the evil things of the north, orcs, trolls, evil men, and for 500 years he waged a relentless war to exterminate the northern kingdoms of Arnor. He was patient. He was cunning. He was utterly without mercy. But what did he feel? It is a question that cuts to the heart of what the Nazgûl became. Did the Witch King feel pride as his armies ground the kingdom of Cardolan to dust? Did Kermul feel satisfaction as the Easterlings bent the knee to Mordor? The truth is far more chilling. They felt nothing. The capacity for joy, pride, or satisfaction had been burned out of them centuries ago. All that remained was a cold, black void, filled only by two things: the driving, all-consuming will of their master, and a deep, burning hatred for the living world. They hate the sun, for its warmth is a memory they can no longer feel. They hate the sound of laughter, for it is a language they no longer understand. They hate the very scent of life itself, the smell of green grass and fresh water, because it is a world from which they are eternally banished. Their infamous cry, that spine-chilling shriek that can stop the heart of the bravest warrior, is not a battle cry. It is the only voice they have left to express the unending agony of their existence. It is the sound of a soul trapped in an eternal, waking nightmare, forever screaming into the void. This despair became their greatest weapon. The black breath, the aura of hopelessness that surrounded them, was a projection of their own inner state. To be near a Nazgûl was to feel your own courage turn to ash, your own hope curdle into dread. It was a spiritual poison, and they were the masters of its deployment. For centuries, this was their state of being. Generals, assassins, and agents of terror, their power waxing and waning with that of their master. When Sauron was strong, they were formidable. But then came the fall. At the end of the Second Age, when the last alliance of elves and men marched on the Black Gate, the Nazgûl were at the height of their power. They were the lieutenants of the Dark Lord's armies. But they were still, and always would be, slaves to the One Ring. When Isildur cut the ring from Sauron's hand, the Master's power was broken, and the chain that gave the Nazgûl form and focus went slack. They were not destroyed, but they were undone. Their connection to the physical world, already tenuous, was severed. Without Sauron's will to command them, their own rage and hatred were not enough to hold them together. They fled, becoming formless, bodiless whispers of malice. For over 1,000 years of the Third Age, they haunted the dark and lonely places of the world, silent and impotent, their minds adrift in a sea of shadow, waiting for the call of the Master. And in the year 1100 of the Third Age, that call began to whisper once more. Sauron, not yet recovered but able to project a sliver of his will, began to gather his power in a stronghold in southern Mirkwood, the Hill of Sorcery, Dol Guldur. And the first of his servants to answer the summons was the one whose domain was closest, Khamûl, the Shadow of the East, the second most powerful of the nine. For centuries he was the necromancer of Dol Guldur, the shadow that lengthened in the forest, his presence slowly poisoning the greenwood, turning it into Mirkwood. The wise, like Gandalf and Elrond, sensed this growing evil but did not yet know its true nature. They thought it was one of the Nazgûl, but they did not suspect it was Sauron himself, for his return was a fear beyond their reckoning. Meanwhile, the Witch King, his own spirit stirring in the cold north, returned to his kingdom of Angmar and completed his life's great, terrible work, the utter destruction of the northern kingdom of Arnor. With Arnor destroyed, the Witch King's purpose in the north was complete. He was eventually driven from Angmar by a combined host of elves from Lindon and men from Gondor, but the damage was done. It was a victory that came too late. And where did the Witch King flee? South, back towards the growing shadow, back towards the Master he had not seen in 2 millennia. By the year 2000 of the Third Age, Sauron's call was strong enough. All nine were drawn together again. They descended upon the Gondorian city of Minas Ithil, the Tower of the Moon, and took it for their own. The beautiful city became a place of horror, its white stone glowing with a pale, sickly green light. It was renamed Minas Morgul, the Tower of Black Sorcery. It became the Nazgûl's fortress, their base of operations for the next 1,000 years, and a permanent watch upon the border of their master's ancient land, Mordor. Here they dwelt, the 9 dreadful lords of a dead city, gathering their strength, breeding foul creatures, and preparing for their master's final return. They were no longer scattered whispers. They were a unified legion, more powerful and more terrifying than ever before. Their long wait was nearly over, and as the Third Age drew to its close, and a small, insignificant creature in a land far away found a simple gold ring, the 9 were given a new task, not of open warfare, not of conquest, but of hunting. A single, desperate hunt that would determine the fate of the entire world. Their hunt was a thing of legend and terror. They were the hounds of Sauron, let loose upon the world with one scent in their minds, the ring. They did not see the world as the living do. They perceived it as a realm of shifting shades, and the bearer of the ring blazed like a white fire in their sight. They swept through the Shire, a cold dread preceding them, their hissing questions in the black speech turning the air to ice. At Weathertop they came close, wounding the ring-bearer with a blade of shadow and poison, a shard of which would have drawn him irrevocably into their deathless world. They were foiled by fire and the courage of a ranger, but their purpose was nearly achieved. They pursued him to the ford of Bruinen, a terrifying chase that ended only when the waters of the river, commanded by elven magic, rose up to sweep their borrowed forms away. But they were not so easily defeated. Reclothed and remounted on fell beasts from an age of nightmare, they returned as captains of war. It was here, before the gates of Minas Tirith, that the Lord of the Nazgûl, the Witch King of Angmar, would finally meet his doom. For millennia he had been invincible. For the prophecy foretold that not by the hand of man would he fall. He stood in his moment of ultimate triumph, the white city on the verge of ruin, and he laughed at the lone warrior who dared to stand against him. But he faced no man. He faced a woman, Arwen of Rohan, and a hobbit, Meriadoc Brandybuck. One blade to break the spell of unmaking that protected him, one sword to deliver the final blow. With a shriek that tore the sky, a cry of agony and disbelief that echoed his long-forgotten humanity, the Witch King was annihilated. His crown rolled away, his hauberk and mantle fell empty, and a spirit of immense malice was dispersed into a wind that was gone. The end for the remaining 8 came not by sword or spell, but by the fulfillment of their very nature. Their existence was alone, granted by the power of the One Ring. For 6,000 years, they had lived on its borrowed time. And when Frodo Baggins stood at the crack of doom, and the ring was at last consumed by the fire in which it was forged, that loan was called due. In that instant, the chain was not merely loosened, it was shattered. The will that held them together, the power that gave them form, vanished from the world. High above the plains of Mordor, they were caught in the storm of their master's ruin. They shrieked one last time, not in terror, but in the pure, final agony of dissolution. They were unmade, their spirits cast out into the eternal nothingness from which there is no return. They who had craved power and life eternal found only oblivion. Their long, dark watch was over. The tale of the Ringwraiths is a chilling echo of the great theme of Arda, that the desire for power, the wish to dominate the wills of others and cheat the gift of death, leads only to a hollow, tormented prison of one's own making. Their fall was not just a victory for the free peoples, but a final, merciful release. The story of the Nazgûl is but one thread in the vast, woven history of Middle-earth, a story of fallen kings, of mighty elves, of steadfast dwarves, and of the great powers that shaped the world itself. From the music of the Ainur to the last ship sailing from the havens, every legend is waiting to be told. To journey with us through these ages of shadow and light, and to uncover the deepest lore of Tolkien's world, subscribe to the Silmarillion Chronicles. The Legendarium awaits.